Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. And as always, I'm joined by...
Bob Bazanko, and I'm in the Lone Star State still
Still in the Lone
for
Star
a
State.
little bit more.
Today, we are joined by Mickey Huff, who is the director of Project Censored. He's also the president of the nonprofit Media Freedom Foundation, and recently joined Ithaca College in New York last fall, where he serves as the distinguished director of the Park Center for Independent Media and is a professor of journalism. Mickey, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
It's an honor to be here with both of you. Thanks so much for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity.
And we're going to be just talking about media and what's covered and what's not covered and what's censored. Mickey, with two collaborators, Shaylee Voidal and Andy Lee Roth, has an annual book they put out called The State of the Free Press. State of the Free Press 2025 is out, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But Mickey, maybe actually just kick off for our audience who's not familiar with Project Censored. We both listened to Project Censored for a long time, but actually just tell us a little bit about Project Censored.
Sure. Project Censored is a media watchdog and critical media literacy education organization. We were founded in 1976, so we're coming up on our 50th anniversary here pretty soon. We were founded at Sonoma State University by Carl Jensen, who started the communications program there. And Project Censored, specifically in that context, was interested in looking at important news and information that was published in the so-called alternative or independent media, the weeklies, more local kind of publications, non-legacy, non-corporate, what people call, quote, mainstream media, right? And back when Carl founded the project, there were the networks and PBS, and there was the major papers, and of course, many more papers. But we didn't have cable, and we didn't have the internet, right? And we certainly didn't have the anti-social media mess that has been unleashed on us in the last decade and a half. But Carl asked a really interesting question based on Nixon's reelection in 1972, and he wondered that given how much was already coming out about Nixon, especially in the alternative independent press, he was curious in retrospect why the major news outlets didn't catch on to some of those things sooner or earlier, given that they were known. You take a look at Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers and the New York Times case and so on. Those were major issues. But there was a lot of other things that were known and just not really showcased or highlighted, including the expansion of the war in Vietnam into Cambodia that sparked major unrest and the Kent State shootings and other things. So Jensen was asking about the role that the press played in society and what they chose to report on, and then what the consequences were regarding civic engagement. And what started as an intellectual exercise, he brought it into the classroom. And that's where he started Project Censored, in the classroom, where he would have students comb through literally hundreds. And back in the day, it was printed, right? Printed copies. You had to subscribe or get printed newsletters or magazines or whatever. And they would comb through these publications to find significant or important stories. And then they would go and they would look into the so-called mainstream. They'd go to the corporate legacy establishment press and they'd be like, did they cover these stories? And so the tagline for Project Censored was the news that didn't make the news and why. And Carl put together a series of journalists and media experts that would help judge the stories. And he ran a newsletter every year where he would publish those stories. And he got early accolades from muckrakers like Izzy Stone, I.F. Stone. And at the Park Center, we do the Izzies every year at Ithaca College, coming up on the 17th annual, honoring muckraking reporting in the public interest. Walter Cronkite at CBS was an early fan of Project Censored, saying that it was an important watchdog that helped the establishment outlets cover things that they might miss. Carl didn't believe that there was some big conspiracy in the press to not cover things. He believed that they were biased because of their business models and that it sometimes either prevented them from seeing or covering certain issues, maybe just because it wasn't on their radar, or because they had different things informing their so-called news judgment. And then, of course, Carl ran the project for 20 years, starting an annual book in 1993. And we've been doing the annual book ever since. I've been doing the annual book with Andy Lee Roth since the 2013 book. And now we brought on board another person, a younger person, Shaylee Voidal, has been working with us for several years, started with us as an intern. Again, I want to emphasize that educational component. We do this in the classroom. We work with a couple dozen campuses across the country now. We're not at Sonoma State anymore, per se. We're a nonprofit under the Media Freedom Foundation. And we really believe that critical media literacy skills are the things that the public needs in order to find the news and information that they need to know, but also to realize where the establishment press really falls short. And I wish I could say that going on 50 years later, that we have a much better and uncensored system of media. But ironically, the more avenues we have, they're owned by fewer and fewer companies. And we have more and more kinds of censorship by proxy and special interest control over our media ecosystem that makes issues like censorship, unfortunately, very relevant in the present day. And so sadly, I think Project Censored is as needed, or maybe more so now, given the complexities of our current information ecosystem.
Yeah. This is a great resource. There's so much in here. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but so just a couple things though. First, is this kind of the worst situation you've seen with regard to press, very overt in many ways, censorship? And then, are there particular areas that, we see this now even worse? Like I'm thinking because as I look through this, stuff on climate change, obviously on Israel, labor. So is this kind of the worst situation you've seen? In what kind of areas do you think this is becoming more pronounced, this kind of press censorship? What kind of stories?
That's a couple of really great questions, important things to discuss. I'm not sure. I certainly won't say that things are great or better. I mean, there are certain indicators that I think that we're seeing a vibrant independent press. We're seeing a resurgence of independent press movements like the Movement Media Alliance that is rebooted. It's a reincarnation of the Media Consortium. I think that a lot of independent journalists are really rising to the occasion to report about important things, but simultaneously, we're seeing more and more consolidation of the corporate press. Just today, to date our conversation, February 26, we wake up to Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post, issuing an edict to the newsroom about how they're going to cover civil liberties and free markets, and they're changing the editorial tone of the page. This is, by the way, Mr. Hands-Off Jeff Bezos, the Washington Post, Democracy Dies in Darkness, with Jeff turning out the light once again. What we're seeing is more consolidation, more corporate media kowtowing to the incoming Trump administration, whether it's the big tech sector, as we saw the billionaires row at the coronation, as it were, or in even legacy media outlets, right? We're seeing major shakeups at places like MSNBC and NBC. Lester Holt is out. Joy Reid is out. We're seeing CNN move more to the center right. So we're seeing a real kowtowing of the corporate press to the moneyed class, which shouldn't be a big surprise to anybody who understands the political economic critique of mass media, going all the way back to Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky in 1988 with their brilliant work, Manufacturing Consent, that introduced the propaganda model about ownership advertising, elite sourcing, flack, and ideological bias. Quite clearly, Jeff Bezos is saying the quiet part out loud about what his bias is at the Washington Post. And we're seeing more and more framing as a form of censorship, right? Censorship by omission, framing, like shrinking the Overton window in terms of what those outlets believe is newsworthy. Just like Chomsky and Herman talked about worthy and unworthy victims, right? Like what's happening in one part of the world is very important because of U.S. interest. What's happening in places like Gaza, not so much, right? Even the New York Times editorial pages said they're not supposed to use certain words or terms when talking about Gaza or Palestinians versus Israelis. We write about that quite a bit in the book, as it was one of the most significantly suppressed stories over the last year was the coverage of what's happening in Palestine. Bob, you mentioned a couple of other major themes that you caught on really quickly. About a third of the stories address climate crisis. Let's not forget that the corporate media for decades both sides that issue, and they would have on the Union of Concerned Scientists on one side of the debate, and on the other, they'd have somebody from the Heartland Institute, who was funded by ExxonMobil, right? Saying, it's a hoax. It's not true. It's not as bad as they say. We've been backsliding ourselves into this crisis for decades, and it's none other than ExxonMobil that was sitting on their own studies of how their products and their industry was causing climate crisis issues, right? We've known this for nearly half a century, right? And they suppressed that information. So it's no surprise that we still see these kinds of stories suppressed. You mentioned too, labor, very important. labor has always been an issue that's underreported in the corporate media because of corporate ownership, because of corporate capitalism. When we see people like Bezos talk about how he wants the Washington Post to cover free markets, that means he doesn't want to cover the horrible labor conditions taking place in his own Amazon warehouses. He doesn't want to talk about the way workers are treated. We could go back well over 100 years, and you both know this, and certainly historically are aware that a lot of the early independent papers and a lot of the early kind of muckraking reporters wrote about capitalist abuses of the labor system, whether it was Ida Tarbell taking down the rock of Standard Oil, or it was Lincoln Steffens' Shame of the Cities talking about the unholy alliances of corrupt politicians and unethical business people, or Upton Sinclair. And again, Carl Jensen at Project Censored went back and really highlighted the importance of these people in a book called Stories That Changed America, Muckrakers of the 20th Century, because those were the very people that influenced him to start Project Censored. People like George Seldes and I.F. Stone, once again. Very influential because these were reporters that were talking about everyday issues that affected everyday Americans, immigrants, laborers, women, people of color struggling under Jim Crow that we saw well into the 1960s. And that, of course, continues to this day, these kinds of challenges and problems. And so, Scott and Bob, that's why we still see those thematic ripples into the present. And if you look at the recent book, there's many stories that are about some of the same issues that we've been writing about for decades and decades. One thing that we have done over the years, we try to write more, or we try to have students, we encourage students to investigate what we call solutions journalism. So it's something that doesn't just expose the troubles and the problems, which of course we need to identify clearly if we're going to face them. But we also want to focus on people, individuals, organizations that are really doing things in the public interest to make a difference. We call that media democracy in action. And so we highlight people in our books and in our work every year that are really doing this kind of good work. And in many cases, it's people like you two doing really great public interest work by having conversations that are in the public interest, having on guests like me that don't get picked up by the corporate media. In all the years that Project Censored's been around, we've only been covered in the New York Times once, and it was last year. And it was ironically an interview where someone contacted me to talk about why there was declining public trust in the establishment press. And I was like, have you read your paper?
Yeah.
And it said they didn't think it was funny. But we don't get this kind of coverage. And I think it's unfortunate because at Project Censored, we don't think that the solution is to just shout it down and say, burn the corporate media down and these kind of things. Look, there's space and room for that when we're talking amongst friends. But in terms of realistic solutions, what we need to do is educate people as to how the media ecosystem works. What does the architecture of censorship look like in purportedly free press systems? What is the role that big tech has played in silencing and platforming various voices, and for what reasons? And then how can the independent press pressure these major organizations that you get enough of people, thousands and thousands of people have been canceling their subscriptions to places like the Washington Post. And look, Bezos is a billionaire, so I guess it's no skin off his back. But yet notice what they keep doing, right? They'll still downsize newsrooms. They'll still editorially play with what the paper is allowed to do. In other words, they're working to make their own voices less relevant. And in that space, Americans who now hold the legacy media probably at its lowest point since it's been recorded, if you go and look at Pew and Gallup and other polls that look at the public opinion of the Fourth Estate. And unfortunately, they've backed themselves into that position by not covering stories that people need to know about. They've turned more into a tabloidized, sensationalized, junk food news, malinformation, news abuse kind of ecosystem that is hell-bent on propagandizing Team Red and Team Blue for the interest of advertisers and shareholders, rather than telling people what's actually happening in their communities that they need to know about in order to better manage their lives. And so the independent press can really help as far as filling that gap. And if the legacy outlets want to follow suit, they too have the resources to cover really important stories, if only their paymasters would allow.
One question I have is in regards to the media ecosystem is like this last election. I think one of the things they called it was the podcast election. We've also we've also seen the rise of Substack. We see like Paul Krugman leave the New York Times and start a Substack, or Jim Acosta leave CNN and start a Substack. And I'm wondering, what you see the role of these new sort of more platform based. I wouldn't quite call them social media, but like these new platform based sort of media outlets. And we're big fans of podcasts, obviously, because we've been doing one for 5 years now.
Look, I think that there's obviously good and bad that can be said about any of the new ways. There are certain issues that I think are replicated, certain concerns that are replicated. What we see in the podcast world that starts out as a wild west of different ideas and different things, also does quickly rival the legacy press. We saw that with Joe Rogan over the years, and the legacy press sort of fretting and freaking out about what's happening in the podcast universe. And it's an unaccountable world. It's a wild west of disinformation. Sure, kind of, maybe, if you have specific examples, but it's also a place where you hear a lot of voices that have been shut out of the corporate media, like your show, for example. You both talk about issues that the corporate media really don't address very often. And if they do it with a particular bias and a particular frame, right? And Substack is another example where if the going gets tough, the tough go to Substack and they start their own thing, right? I think some of the challenges associated with that, and where I might have some critique, is that to me, both the podcast world and the Substack world have somewhat of a cult of personality focus. Rather than being issues driven, they're often personality driven.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the best direction for public interest journalism. I'm not saying that people on Substack or people that have podcasts are not doing important work. What I'm saying is an overall impression that I get from the rise of these two, this new media, if you will, right? It's not really that new. It's just, we've had newsletters for a long time and subscription models for a long time. And, you go back far enough, Scott Berkeley, Community Media, KPS, where I do the Project Censored show, started as the first community radio station in the country for the Pacifica Network, right? That was a bottom-up, grassroots movement of reporting in the community interest, and didn't have commercial money and didn't have advertising and didn't have corporate money telling them what to do. So I think there's a lot of hope with some of the new platforms, and people have more choices. But now I'm going to go back to this issue. I think that those choices are maximized in their public impact when people are more media literate, when people are more aware of what's happening in the media ecosystem, when people are more aware of how these companies buy up so many of each other, right? And maybe some of their favorite podcasts are now owned by some corporate conglomerate, or somebody that went over to Substack is now getting money on the side to support what they're doing, or they have big donors doing it. And that's not always made known to the public. You mentioned Krugman. Krugman was actually pushed out at the New York Times. It wasn't a personal choice of his necessarily to go over to Substack. They just had enough of his, what I would say was tepid, liberal focus at times. I wouldn't call him a firebrand. He's certainly not a red-green character in my estimation. But that was even too much at the Times, right? That's too much for the old gray lady, as it's called, right? The paper of record. They can't even have an award-winning economist talk about the importance of liberal ideas. Never mind that you don't have to adopt them, but it's too much for them to even pretend that they exist anymore, right? We live in the era now of sawing everything off that's to the left of right center, right? And now we have people in the right center that are being seen as somehow far left ideologues, right? That's all part of the shrinking of the Overton window. That's all part of the major propaganda campaigns by the corporate media, by big tech, to minimize diversity in public discourse. And censorship, algorithmic censorship, shadow banning, demonetization, censorship by proxy, those are all ways of limiting debate that have nothing to do with government, right? It's not prior restraint, so it doesn't fit into the old categories of First Amendment protections. It's all about the marketplace of ideas. If you've got billionaires owning the marketplace of ideas, don't expect any ideas that don't support that marketplace to exist, right? That's hardly information democracy. And again, I go back to media literacy, and part of what we do at Project Censored is we provide information and curriculum for free at projectcensored.org about the power of frame checking. Andy Roth and Shaylee Voidal did a 60-page primer that is connected to Common Core that teachers can pick up and adopt and use in their curriculum to teach people to be more media literate about how choices of what's being shown to you in the establishment press are not the only choices, right? We heard about fact checking and the outsourcing of fact checking. Fact checking is something that I thought journalists were supposed to do. If I don't mean to sound too old fashioned here, but I thought that's what journalists, editors, and ombudspersons were for, right? Not Snopes or the Atlantic Council at Facebook, right? When Meta and Zuckerberg was talking about firing the fact checkers, I'm like, good riddance to the Atlantic Council. I don't need NATO fact checking my posts over at Facebook, right? They never mentioned those kinds of details about who's actually watching the watchers, right? And that gives the public, I think, a real false sense of security that lulls them into this idea that maybe social media is better because it allows me to pick what I want to see. That kind of confirmation bias doesn't introduce us to complicated or ideas that may go against our own belief systems, which means we end up in our own siloed belief kind of chambers. We end up in our own sort of hyper partisan niches that don't allow us to understand each other, that don't allow us to experience other ideas in an intellectual way. And they further reproduce the Team Red, Team Blue brand of media consumption that's often mindless, sensationalized, tabloidized, but it does tend to carry the day. And then these same corporate news outlets on Team Red and Team Blue do polls to see how much of their propaganda is sticking with their base. It has nothing to do with reporting in a democratic republic in the public interest. It has nothing to do with reporting under the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. It's back to what Carl Jensen talked about almost 50 years ago. It's about how the news has turned into a for-profit industry.
I'm old enough to remember when investigative journalists were still hired and they were given attention to. Cy Hirsch and Woodward Bernstein in the mid-'70s. And Chris Hedges worked for the New York Times at one point. And
Until he didn't.
right. And now we're getting rid of Paul Krugman, who I think is a good liberal economist. Yeah. And is that merely because of the profit, the economic motives, or is there a greater alliance now between the media and the government? I'm just curious because I teach. And so one of the prevalent points I make is that you have to be careful about what you read and believe, especially in social media memes. Because I have students now arguing historical facts with me because they saw something on Facebook. But is it basically just because there's so much money in this ecosystem now, or it's like going back to the propaganda model, right? Has that changed at all? It's like a quick way of saying this. Has the propaganda model changed in any way because of like social media and the kind of technological changes we have?
Again, another brilliant positing of let's think about that. Just before Ed Herman passed away, he did a 30-year retrospective on the propaganda model for us at Project Censored. We published it, the propaganda model at 30. He published a version of it at Monthly Review, but the last thing he published before he passed away was the chapter version of this in our Censored 2018 book. And interestingly enough, and Ed had a really acerbic sense of humor too. And it was often very self-deprecating. It was an honor to get to talk to him and get to know him a little bit when he was 92 years old. And the conclusion that he came to, because I was very curious, I was wondering if he would say, oh, it's outdated or it's not the same. And you know what he came back and said is he was like, I think it's more useful than ever. We have to expand some of the definitions and we have to allow for big tech and social media platforms and some of these other things, which, by the way, were even different when he was writing about it. And that was only about, 8 years ago or something. A lot has changed, and yet a lot has remained the same, right? There's now even more concentrated money, 5 big tech firms, half a dozen major companies with their corporate media conglomerates, right? We're working more like this than like this, right? We're always told that the competition will keep the American public informed because they'll be trying to get the big scoop, right? We know this, that the big scoops are fewer and further between, and the big scoops have to go to Substack to get published because the Washington Post or the New York Times don't always want to publish the big scoop. Some would think that the killing of tens of thousands of innocent people in Gaza would be a really important story. Yet most of the corporate media in this country refuse to acknowledge it, refuse to cover it, no matter how many international human rights organizations came on board, gradually, mind you, not knee-jerk, but gradually on board to the arguments about genocide. And the UN, slow bodies, imperfect, but still in the face of such evidence, we still see the corporate media blinkered, right? We still see them unable to talk about it. We still see people being let go from jobs because they have the temerity to mention. Even in the press itself, where you look at Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders and Freedom of the Press Foundation's Freedom Tracker, and you take a look at the global assault, not just in the United States, but the global assault on press freedoms and journalists themselves, overwhelmingly, the amount of people that are journalists that have died have been in Palestine, right? This is a data point, right? I don't mean to be insensitive. I just mean, how can you ignore it and still call yourself a journalist? Your own profession is literally under assault everywhere we look. Don't forget that the United States dropped to 54th or 55th in press freedom on the Reporters Without Borders ranking last year. Coming up here in May, International Press Freedom Day, for celebrating media freedom issues, they'll release their next report. This is something that's I think it's really disconcerting that the press can't even cover the attacks on their own institutions. It's very bizarre. We see this happening when we saw Sam Husseini being manhandled and grabbed and dragged out of the last hagiographic press conference, quote unquote, that Anthony Blinken was giving as Secretary of State. We see people at town halls, like in Idaho, being an attorney and a former candidate being dragged out for daring to ask things like, is this a lecture or a public forum? Like, will we, the people, actually get an opportunity to talk? Or will elected officials grandstand and obfuscate for the whole time to carry on some dog and pony show charade that we actually have a real democratic republic? Those are some disconcerting things that we write about in the books each year, that we've really started to focus on the state of the free press itself. What is the health of our free press? And why don't people who are in such privileged positions with the better paying jobs at the major media outlets with the protection of the First Amendment, why don't they turn their attention to the attacks on their own profession? And I think that's a really glaring question that we should be pressing in the public. We should be pushing more and more for the press to cover how this administration, never mind the problems of the last administration, there were many, including meddling with social media, right? But this administration has come out with the gloves off. They're attacking the Associated Press because they have the temerity to suggest that the rest of the world still calls it the Gulf of Mexico. But now they don't get a seat at the table, right? And of course, there's now a reshuffling at groups that don't get office space or connection to things at the Pentagon. The press is being shut out of asking important questions about Elon Musk and what Doge is doing, which is arguably illegal in many ways. So I think we do, unfortunately, have a crisis in the Fourth Estate, but there are some areas of hope that are coming from these other unlikely sectors, the podcast world, Substack, and yes, Bob, even TikTok.
Unfortunately, just ask
Americans talk about getting their news from social media. And again, I cringe at that on one level. But let's not forget, the reason that TikTok was targeted for banning, was because people in Congress realized that people were using it for information.
I was just going to ask you about that, yeah.
And they said the quiet part out loud again. Both Blinken and Romney said that the reason that they were targeting TikTok was because of the Gaza coverage, and that they couldn't control how it was radicalizing young people on America's campuses. Because young people were getting information from social media without a filter, right? And we know that there can be real issues and challenges and problems with that. But a lot of that information coming out of Gaza was not covered in the corporate media, these people were not being shown it, right? And yet they're seeing it with their own eyes, right? And then look, we now know there have been several polls done since the election, and it turns out that the issue of Gaza and the uncommitted voters in swing states may have actually helped tip the balance of the election to Trump. Because the Democrats ignored this and they thought, we'll just ban TikTok because why? Owned by a Chinese company, so they couldn't use their political leverage to suppress coverage like they did with Facebook, right? Earlier. And we write about this again in the book, right? And again, it doesn't matter to me if people believe it or not. We have demonstrable evidence that this is taking place. We have people saying the quiet parts out loud in public, justifying censorship on the basis of subject content, right? Which is anathema. Anybody that lives in this country should think that's preposterous, no matter who's doing it, right? But yet we then somehow find ourselves in these curious debates, right? About we've got to control that information. And if only an American company owned it, TikTok would be just fine. And then there's that whole business of it going dark for half a day and then coming back online, very different and peculiar. Yet nobody wants to go in and address it. The major media outlets don't want to talk about it. Politicians still frittering away, twiddling their thumbs, wondering about what to do about the TikTok problem. They said it out loud. The editor of the Wall Street Journal, when speaking at the World Economic Forum last year, said out loud, "We are losing control over the narrative. Social media is challenging the role of the legacy press, and we need to take the control back." They say it out loud, man. I'm not making this up, right? And that should be concerning to us, not because there's trouble with social media. Of course there is. And the addiction, the screen addiction, and the confirmation bias trouble, let alone the data harvesting and fallen surveillance issues and all of these other dark problems around that stuff. I'm not ignoring that. But I think that what we need to focus on is critical media literacy education, which is why we co-authored a book called The Media and Me, which is a guide to critical media literacy for young people. We're not teaching our young people how that these things are working. We're not teaching them how they're surveilled. We're not teaching them how they are the product. We're not teaching them to ask critical questions about media and information sources. And that's where we have to start. We have to start by teaching this whole generation that Stanford University called digital natives, right? And the assumption originally was that the young people are so used to using the gadgets, they won't be fooled. Guess what? They were just as fooled as all of us can be fooled. And Bob, you said in classrooms, they come up and say, "I saw something on Instagram that says that this is not what happened." And that's it. Look, that can create a really interesting conversation about pedagogy. It can create a really interesting conversation about fact checking. It can create important informed teachable moments about bias, right? But the notion that somehow that these folks want to come up and challenge you as a history professor on historical facts, I do find amusing, but I do welcome those in class. And I appreciate when they come forward, as I know you do.
Yeah.
They ask the questions and you get to actually have deeper informed discussions that the corporate media never have. It's all about concision and talking points and gotcha this and talking over people. And they don't really go deep into these investigations and they don't go deep into historical facts so that we're denied the opportunity to think deeply about important issues.
You mentioned earlier how we have this new kind of ecosystem, right? Podcast and whatever, blogs and things like that. One thing that always strikes me is when the media reaches out to liberal experts, right? These are people who confirm what they're thinking, right? The Washington Post and the New York Times editors. Is that, because I know Chomsky at some time ago talked about that. Do you still see that where you're getting, these people have the veneer of liberalism around them. So they're different. They're the left or whatever the media wants to call them, right? But they're also saying, yeah, let's send more money to Ukraine and let's bomb Gaza. And so they're really buying into it, but they have that, oh, look, the liberals support us too kind of thing.
Yeah, you're describing neoliberalism, right?
Yeah,
you're describing the neoliberal corporate center right of our system. As you mentioned, we mentioned Chomsky already. Chomsky once argued, in addition to saying that education is a form of potential indoctrination, by parading these kinds of limited expert views and ignoring anything outside of that. He said the same thing about the establishment media. And I remember him saying, if they were better propagandists, they would invite actual leftists, socialists, Marxists, anarchists, red, green. They would actually invite them on more because in the 1 minute or 2 minute sound bites you get, you could never go into the historical contextual details enough to support what you're saying because most of those programs are predicated on very specific and narrow assumptions about American history, American quote unquote democracy. And you would just sound like you were from outer space, right? And Chomsky said, the funny thing is that when they do invite me on, I barely get warmed up and they're cutting me off or changing the subject and moving on to something else. And I end up looking like an idiot because I need at least 15 minutes to warm up. You know this from the classroom. We get a 90-minute run a couple days a week. You get to set things up. You get to set up the differences, and you get to set up context, and you get to frame many different questions, and you get feedback, and you actually have a dialogue, which means there's at least a couple things going on. It's not just a one-way street. And so much of our corporate media is a one-way street. So much of it is fire hose of information that's very winnowed and controlled. And then anybody that's left with a question is, yeah, but wait, yeah, but what about what? And then they cut the commercial and they come back and change the subject. And so the other thing too, I think that's really important that you just brought up is sourcing. And that's, again, the third element of the propaganda model. They tend to, in the corporate media, interview each other. They interview the elected officials who are all put into office with dark money. They elect corporate executives and investors and the important people, right? And even when they talk about activists, they go to people who are like the heads of activist organizations. And look,
Or some
Occupy,
random wingnut on the street. There's a lot of that too.
dude, always, Scott, always you have to have some wingnut on the street that's going to say some outlandish stereotypical thing that they get to point to and say, there you go. That's how the crazy activists think. That's why we don't talk to them more, right?
Yeah.
But it's that reliance on that kind of source that means they really don't talk to people who are often affected by the very subjects they think they're addressing. Take a look at the Real News Network and the coverage that they did out of Baltimore and East Palestine, Ohio. Take a look at the work that Max Alvarez and independent reporters did by actually going into that community, reaching across red-blue divides, and sitting down with members of the community that realized how badly that their community was being screwed over by the Norfolk Railway, by the transportation secretary, by the Biden administration, now by the Trump administration, right? And they went in and did a series of reports that actually talked to people in the community about how deeply they were affected and impacted. And they specifically talked to people that had voted for Trump. They talked to people who didn't, but they just talked to people about how this horrible corporate malfeasance happens 1,000 times a year in the United States, train derailments, and how it negatively impacts their community. That's the kind of journalism that people need. That's the kind of journalism that I would argue, despite red or blue, that people want. When something goes down in your community, people don't necessarily want to get into that game. They want to find out what's happening, who's at risk, who's helping, what can we do? People need to put aside, but it's hard to put that aside because our corporate media has turned into the WWE. You know, as Matt Taibbi wrote about years ago in Hate Incorporated, like we have it's like a worldwide wrestling thing, right? And the media is now a third ring in the circus, right? They're no longer outside. They're part of the carnival barking, and they made themselves part of that narrative where Trump called them the enemy of the people. And they're like, by golly, we're going to jump into the ring and be heroes. For who? They're not heroes of working people, the corporate media. They're not standing up against corruption and malfeasance and environmental degradation. If they were, I wouldn't have to fill these books every year with these stories from the independent press covering the issues that the corporate media won't. In other words, we wouldn't need Project Censored to talk about the news that didn't make the news and why, because the fourth estate would be fully functioning in the public interest and we would actually have a legitimate democratic republic.
The other thing you talk in the book, which I think is really related, is how they flood also our media ecosystem with junk news. Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce dating or broken up or what have you. All of that sort of like garbage celebrity news, which really dominates in many ways. And that's, a lot of kids watch that on TikTok and Instagram as well.
I don't care to see it and I can't not see it. There's whole parts of my brain that have been colonized by what Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce are doing. I have zero interest. I wish they don't need any of my well wishes. I don't care what they're doing. And look, I don't want to finger wag people's guilty pleasures either. People like entertainment. People maybe they like their escape, whatever it is, right? And I'm not saying there's not some harm in that. But the real harm is when that stuff starts to overtake the news cycle. And it is woven into the New York Times can't not cover, CNN can't go a day without covering some big diss in the rap community or something that happened at the SAG Awards they get sucked into the whole thing too, right? And that's when we write about Carl Jensen coined this term junk food news in the early 1980s, because when he was criticizing the legacy press, he was saying, I challenge your news judgment. I'm curious as to whether or not you really don't have time to cover important stories. And so he said, I'll tell you what, in addition to looking at things that you don't cover, I'm going to start paying attention to what you do cover. And Junk Food News was born. He was like, so you don't have any time to cut the labor issues. You couldn't possibly cover this big story about October Surprise. You couldn't cover these important issues, but you could cover Clara Bell and Where's the Beef commercial for Wendy's. You had plenty of time to cover O.J. Simpson from wall to wall ad infinitum. You had plenty of time to cover grief porn, like a celebrity dies and it's wall to wall, right? And we covered this years ago. After 9/11 was one of the longest spans of uninterrupted news coverage about what was happening in the commercial media, where they went hours without having a commercial, right? And that's a big deal for the for-profit system, right? So you figure must be an important thing, the events of 9/11, that they're just really covering this. Do you know when the next longest uninterrupted, non-commercial interrupted news media event was? The death of Anna Nicole Smith. So those are the bookends of American media, right? 9/11 and the death of Anna Nicole Smith, who was a former stripper that married an old oil tycoon and inherited his money, right? And then tragically later died herself, right? A horrible and crazy story. But again, news judgment? Come on, that shows a very serious lack of erudite news judgment or historically contextual news judgment. And unfortunately, we write a chapter on junk food news every year, Scott. Last year, we wrote about the pink washing of the Barbie escapade, which was like an hour and a half advertisement for Mattel. And life in plastic, it's fantastic because you have a big glob of microplastics in your brain. So we write about those issues tongue in cheek, but we write about them in a way that it's not about like your guilty pleasure that you liked it. We write about how the corporate media further cover those stories instead of covering stories that actually matter.
This has been great. I know we're getting close, but I think we have time for a couple more questions. And let me say, I really do appreciate what you do. I was turned on to Project Censored, who knows, years ago when Alex Coburn wrote about it.
From Counterpunch.
So that's how I learned about it. So I've been following you guys for a really long time, and I appreciate it. I follow this, and Scott and I both, we're familiar with Ben Bagdikian and all the media critiques, and obviously Herman and Chomsky. So I don't think I'm naive about what the media has always been, but I do think in the last several years, especially with regard to Trump, there's something different going on. And I just wonder, it just seems that Trump will make the most insane claims, and they might push him a little bit, and then he just bellows and they back off.
Yeah.
And compared to even like in my era, Dan Rather and Peter Jennings seem to be like at least a little ask some tough questions, right? Do you think this is like the almost late stage of the media as we know it, or?
It's certainly late stage for the legacy press, and that's why they lash out at these other areas like podcasting. They weren't mad that Joe Rogan was like scooping them on issues. They were mad because he had 12 million people a week tuning in, and they had one or two at best. Even Fox at its top rated programs was getting like maybe a couple million viewers, which out of 300 plus million people is a drop in the bucket. So
Yes,
we should really rethink about how influential these kind of organizations are or even ought to be. But to your point, I think seriously, Nolan Higdon and I wrote a book for City Lights. It came out in 2019 called United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation and Post-Truth America and What We Can Do About It. And we looked at what was happening to the corporate media in the Trump era. And we saw Trump as a symptom of this. We didn't say that. And again, a lot of the people in the press, especially the liberal press, were like, Trump is the problem, Trumpification of this, Trump that. And it's, look, you need to drop Trump for a minute and focus on what's happening. How is the power structure being rearranged? How is the media ecosystem, as Steve Bannon said, how is he flooding the zone? How are they fire hosing such idiotic nonsense? The guy is a grifter con man from a TV show who's a billionaire, a guy that was born on third base thinking he hit a triple, bankrupted tons of businesses, didn't pay contractors, treated labor like garbage, is guilty of things like sexual assault, has all kind of felony convictions, whom his claim to fame was like making a cameo in Home Alone and saying, "You're fired." They inflated this guy. The media helped prop up this court jester of the American late capitalist system, right? They have a responsibility in creating this kind of platform where they just couldn't turn away. It's the train wreck that they helped cause that they had to keep looking at, right? And look, you go back and take a look at Les Moonves before he got Me Too'd over at CBS. In 2016, right before the election at a tech conference in San Francisco, he said, "Keep going, Donald. It may be bad for America, but it's damn good for CBS." He was talking about the absolute sort of lunatic level of spectacle that Trump could create and generate. And he would say one outlandish thing after the other. And by the time the media caught up with it, he was already on to something else. Meanwhile, he's got Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon and a whole bunch of other henchmen trying to dismantle the administrative state and to undo the New Deal, which even Newt Gingrich couldn't do when Clinton was helping him do it during the 90s. And that's exactly what we see now, is a more fast and furious version with Elon Musk and Doge, is an illegal dismantling of the federal infrastructure that's going to harm the poorest and most vulnerable of Americans, while the House passes a budget that's going to balloon the federal deficit by a few $1 trillion, give more tax breaks to the rich, and gave another $100 billion to the military-industrial complex, including Musk. It's absolutely astounding. So the press has dug its own hole in a lot of ways. The legacy press has dug its own hole. And when Trump comes along and says they're the enemy of the people and he attacks, the press can't even muster enough support for itself to push back and put aside their differences momentarily and think, look, man, you have crossed a line. You are crossing a line of checks and balances. Look, that's what we're seeing willy-nilly right now. We're seeing checks and balances being challenged and run roughshod over right and left. Or I would say right and more right. How far can we go with this kind of Grover Norquist strategy of shrinking government down to the size where it can be drowned in a bathtub, as he talked about during the Nixon years when Lewis Powell was writing the memo to the Chamber of Commerce and the American Enterprise Institute was coming on board and the Heritage Foundation that now gave us Project 2025 all came out of the Nixon years. This has been a half-century enterprise to deconstruct American government and the New Deal and the Great Society programs that saw government as a positive force in people's lives, not something that needed to be totally destroyed and so that the country could be handed over to a handful of unaccountable tech bros and billionaires.
The other thing that really strikes me is on Trump is that also earlier you talked about he's coming in with the gloves off and he's icing the Associated Press out because they're still calling it the Gulf of Mexico. But he's escalated in many other ways. Like ABC just settled for $15 million. He sued Meta over censorship. He's suing CBS over a 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris. But we're also seeing where the U.S. attorney in D.C. is actually saying he'll prosecute journalists for interfering with, which I read as reporting on Doge. And he's also, I think, called for like Washington Post op-ed writers to be fired. And so it's also like, it's even more aggressive too. It's like as aggressive as you can get at this point. It's not like Gaza, but it's like, it's something that we haven't actually seen in a long time.
Yeah, no, it's in your face. And if you thought Trump was nasty with the press earlier, with people like Gianforte body slamming Guardian journalists in the governor's election in Montana, wrestling, we're coming back to the wrestling motif. We're going to see even more of that. We're going to see more brazen attacks against the press. And I say what's very unfortunate about what ABC did with Stephanopoulos is they capitulated. And the Maine governor recently, when Trump was attacking her personally at that event where he was talking about withholding money if she didn't comply on certain issues, she said brilliantly, "We'll see you in court." And then he continued to go down the road of, yeah, I'd love that. I relish the chance. You're not even going to be an elected official. He went with his petty personal bullying as he always does. When is the press going to stand up to that and call it behavior that is unfit for the office? The absolute bullying, threatening, and illegal withholding of monies to people who won't kowtow. I'm afraid the press isn't going to be that defender, because ABC is capitulating even when Stephanopoulos barely misspoke, right? Barely misspoke about what he said about Trump's convictions for sexual assault. We see CBS doing the same. They were editing some of this word salad interview with Kamala Harris, and now all of a sudden, what, they're responsible for Trump winning the election? I'm losing where the narrative's even going here. But it's an attack where they're now not just going after defamation, which is hard to prove. They're now going after consumer rights issues where they're going after the media, saying that the media is committing consumer fraud, right? And that's a different animal because it's a business thing. It's not a First Amendment thing anymore, right? And so the Trump administration is doing everything they can and end around in the First Amendment to punish non-compliant media outlets. Just talked about this last week on the Project Censored show with Seth Stern and Lauren Harper from Freedom of the Press Foundation. Also, the Trump administration has recently said book bans are a hoax, even though they're at record levels. The attacks on curriculum, the attacks on the right to read, the attacks on the First Amendment, they're coming from all over the place. They're just coming from different places so that they can try to achieve what they have failed to achieve in the past. And Scott, I think that you're right. And I think that we need to be much more vigilant, and we must be ready to push back against the many assaults against our civil liberties, and particularly our First Amendment rights and press freedom rights, that even when media outlets like corporate media outlets that I criticize are being targeted and being attacked, I have to put my criticism aside momentarily to say, no, you don't attack the Associated Press that way. No, you don't attack ABC or CBS that way. My criticisms of those outlets are very different. Right? They are very rooted in fact. They are not about ideological principles. They are like, the press is supposed to inform the public. Here's where you're falling short. The Trump administration doesn't care at all for that. They just want to silence any critics. And I'm not saying the Biden administration didn't want to silence their critics either. They just did it in different ways. And we're also seeing it in foreign policy, where we're seeing a move away from the soft power of USAID. We've been critics of USAID and Project Censored for years because of some of the harm that they do and the propaganda that they peddle. Yeah. But to pretend like that they've done nothing good, and it's a full-on attack where you can cherry pick it and get rid of all of these things that have happening, and they're going to a return of hard power, the hard power of ultimatums, and literally saying out loud, they're going to just colonize the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They're going to go in and just take the Ukrainian resources. We're back to, Trump mentioned McKinley, we're back to that kind of gloves off imperialism and unbridled capitalism that we saw cause so many problems 120 some years ago.
We just did a brilliant episode on
We just did a show on
brilliant.
I'm from Niles, Ohio.
Guess what? I went to college at Youngstown State and did graduate work in Niles, Ohio.
No way.
And I did my graduate thesis on the Kent State shootings. Right. I grew up outside of Newcastle. Yeah. And I was in California in Berkeley, 25 years, Berkeley, Sonoma. Sacramento area, and then I just recently
Ron DeSantis or Ron DeSantis' parents met at Youngstown State.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I was there back in the 90s, man, and that's where I did my history graduate work and undergraduate work. Yeah. And of course, that place is now run by a president football coach and has been gutted, much like we're seeing it.
He's the lieutenant governor now.
Oh yeah, it's unbelievable.
Do we have time for another question, Scott? Or one thing I'm curious, because the media, and I think correctly, reported on Biden being addled toward the end. They should have done it sooner even. But, But I try not to follow TV news at all. It's just too painful. But I did watch part of the debate, and Trump was insane, right? He's talking about eating dogs and cats, and he makes these statements. He said, everyone in America wanted abortion, wanted Roe v. Wade overturned and sent to the states, right? But they let him say all that shit, and they just
They let him say
the dogs and cats thing. But and this is in every interview I see with him, he says this the most outrageous stuff, and they may say, and then they'll let it go.
I think that's where the press needs to be in solidarity, and the press can't let it go. When one of their own members is dragged out of a press conference, everybody in the room should stand up and say, absolutely not. Yeah. Your time at the mic is over. You're now going to answer to the people. Yeah. This is what the press is for. But unless the press has a spine, we are not going to see that happen. And all those people that sat there and watched Sam Husseini get carried out are guilty. They are all guilty of being obedient in advance by going along. And that was in the Biden administration. They're basically setting the stage for Trump to decide who gets into the pressers. He's now claiming he has a right to kick anybody out that he doesn't want to talk to or want to deal with. And it's absolutely authoritarian. It should be called out at every turn. But the reason a lot of those reporters from major outlets sitting there don't stand up to support somebody from the independent press is because they're worried they'll lose their job because their corporate paymaster wants them to go along and ask the safe questions that they were spoon-fed and not actually hold people accountable. Yeah. And that is the most grotesque of a failure of the fourth estate that we are now witnessing in real time that is allowing the Trump administration to get away with these egregious lies, falsehoods, and abuses of authority.
Before we came on, Scott and I were talking about The Wire, and I said that the arc with the guys from the Baltimore Sun, that's real life today. That's real today.
Yeah. You mentioned the Baltimore Sun reminds me of H.L. Mencken and the bourgeoisie, lamenting how the public can be fooled by sensational press and junk news. And that was 100 years ago. Here we are, full circle with that dealing. I sometimes wonder what he or Hentoff would say today, about the state of our press. I also would at least like to end on a positive note by saying we do fill our books with important, intrepid journalists that are covering major issues every year in Project Censored. You can go to projectcensored.org and see that. You can see how people are really trying to cover this. It's the independent press that's doing it much more than the legacy press. And I think that the legacy press should be more and more influenced by independent outlets. We need more of these people. We need to be training people, as Carl Jensen said in our journalism programs. We should be churning out more muckrakers and fewer buckrakers if we're going to actually be able to maintain this kind of a society in the public interest, and we're going to be able to hold people in power to account. So thank you, Bob and Scott, for having me on. Thank you so much for your interest in Project Censored and just helping let people know that there are a lot of things happening in the independent media world. There are a lot of great, accurate sources for information. We just have to be more proactive about how we get them and share them with our communities.
Thank you. And I'm sure we'll talk again and keep raking around in that muck.
Folks, we've been talking with Mickey Huff with Project Censored, talking about the state of the free press in 2025. If you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit subscribe. If you're listening to this on an audio platform, give us a rate and review. And then if you really like us, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And Mickey, it's been fantastic talking to you today. Everyone else out there, make a lot of trouble and misbehave. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much, guys.